Since the beginning of gaming as a medium, developers have drawn on just about everything for inspiration. Not just in an aesthetic sense, but also for the design philosophy used to develop the game itself, its gameplay, its mechanics. Of course, devs take inspiration from other games all the time, but sometimes the experience a game is meant to give is decidedly different, and might have a development mindset that draws on another medium. Many game developers have borrowed from film or literature for inspiration in regards to how they structure and approach their games. But at the very beginning, particularly in Japan, many developers and designers liken themselves to electronic toy makers. Something you can really feel from the bright colors to the more simple and cartoony themes. A mindset that younger, often independent devs have really tried to push back on in recent years. Toys are bad. We don't want games to be compared to toys because our medium, our hobby, has to consistently deal with derisive comments likening them to feel-good playthings and not being capable of any higher artistic relevance. Now obviously we can see these comments for the ridiculous, untrue, intellectually insecure trash that they are, and if you're as deep into the history of games and game design as I am, you already know that games are capable of creating profound experiences that make you think for players everywhere. But I don't think we should be completely ashamed and tucking away the titles that wear their toyness on their sleeve either. Personally, I believe even games that are made for entertainment have artistic merit through tight craftsmanship alone. The game can really leave a lasting impact on someone, even if it doesn't have anything grand to say about life or the human condition. And it's here that we enter the ludography of Toshio Iwai, an artist specializing in interactive and installation art who branched out into games several times over the span of just under 20 years, delivering one-of-a-kind experiences very similar in design philosophy to his installations and toys he had become enamored with at the same time. Most of these late 19th century toys Iwai began to craft and tinker with around the same time he got into computers, starting with phanakistoscopes and zoetropes, and eventually, most crucial, handmade music boxes with punch cards fed through them. Iwai has openly declared many of his games as toys, and it's not hard to see given the playful, interactive, and above all else simple design of his games, which runs parallel to the pre-cinematic toys he was so fascinated with. Nearly all of Iwai's games have no plot, typically have no win condition, or even personal goals the player can set for themselves. If you really want to be semantic, you could refute them even being games at all. In essence, they're each cutesy, playful toy boxes that challenge the player to engage with music on an interactive level, incentivizing them via gamification. To this day, there's few other titles out there that are like them. Creative sandbox-like titles have gotten big over the years, no doubt, but the elegant simplicity, the low barrier for entry that encompasses a Toshio Iwai game has seldom ever been matched. Anyone, particularly kids, can jump in and simply fiddle around with the program, watching as their gameplay creates the score, while some of the titles are capable of actually creating pretty elaborate pieces. And if you take into account how far back some of these games span, they're technically some of the earliest music games in existence, and the first time an installation artist branched into games, bringing the design philosophies of that medium along as well. While Iwai's games are tragically underappreciated, game companies did, in fairness, take a shot on his bold concepts, starting with his first game which he pitched to the publisher ASCII when he was still a graduate student. 1987's Otocky for the Famicom Disk System. Otocky both sets the standard for what we can expect from Iwai's later titles, while also standing firmly apart from them on account of it being his first game, and also having come out of a budding industry, where more experimental titles were harder to come by. Otocky is by far the most accessible and easily understandable of the games we're going to be covering today, as it really is more of a traditional game rather than a gamified instrument. Sticking with what was popular and understood at the time, Otocky is a 2D shooter with rhythm and beat mostly being left out of the core gameplay. And that even includes a celebrity endorsement, in this case from Natsuki Ozawa, a singer and actress that would eventually go on to become an adult video actress.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
But make no mistake, Otocky is a game that feels insanely contemporary all the same. Even though staying on rhythm isn't a core part of the experience, it's still technically one of the first ever music games to be made, and few games have dared to do something similar even now. So okay, what's the goal here? Rather than floating towards a predetermined end goal like most other shmups, Otocky puts the initiative in the hands of the player, as you need to grab enough music notes throughout an infinitely looping level to proceed to a boss fight, after which the level will be cleared. Aside from shooting enemies that try to bum rush you, your shots also collect the notes, and you'll often have to shoot them out of hiding places, almost Mario style, which will also reveal power-ups. It's a subtle difference, but what really makes Otocky stand apart is the way that you shoot. Rather than a static line of fire going straight ahead of you, if you press one of the 8 directions on the D-pad as you fire, the shot will go in that direction and then snap back to you, almost like a yo-yo. Mastering your 8-directional firing is essential to beating every stage, especially since Otocky himself often isn't quick enough to just fly into the notes, so you'll really have to rely on your ability to nab them out of the air. Enemies also fly in pretty erratic patterns around you, explicitly testing your ability to snipe them from all angles, which honestly feels so satisfying. On top of that, every time the level loops back, any notes you claimed on your first go-around will be replaced with enemies, so the player needs to keep track of what stones were unturned, as well as the patterns of both enemies and notes. But this memorization won't help you on return playthroughs, since the patterns in each level are randomized, but they stay consistent during the loop, of course. These really tight and unique mechanics paired with some cute, colorful visuals would already make Otocky stand apart from the endless flood of other shooters available on the Famicom. What really ties it all together, however, and makes Otocky stand out light years ahead of the pack and still memorable almost 35 years later, is the way the soundtrack is actually generative. The only background score in Otocky, aside from the boss battles, is a simple beat that plays on an endless loop. Every time you pop off a shot, it lets out a note, and each shot fired in succession becomes a melody. The notes are also fixed in a predetermined scale, so no matter how often or how little you're firing, even if you're just noodling around on the D-pad with no real rhythm, it always sounds natural and like it's making a genuine tune. The directional shooting in Otocky already feels really good, but having a melody that you yourself are composing on the fly accompanying it will hook you almost immediately. Plus, the way that typical shmup mechanics are retooled in Otocky are all made with the express purpose of emphasizing this generative soundtrack idea. The power-ups you grab, aside from changing your type of fire, also change the instrument to play a different note when you shoot. Instead of options, you get a power-up that records your earlier shots, layering your notes on top of each other. It's such a simple idea, but to see how far they push it and have the design revolve entirely around it is awe-inspiring for such an old title. It really is a shame that Otocky was denied a release outside of Japan, but it's kind of understandable why. The disc system had a noticeably superior sound quality to the base Famicom, or NES for that matter, and a game that's entirely centered around a generative soundtrack wouldn't really work if they had to strip down the sound channels the way other companies did with Zelda 2 or Castlevania 3, for example. In fact, it's safe to say that without the superior sound quality of the disc system, Otocky wouldn't have been made at all. Like I mentioned before, however, it's also the least emblematic of Iwai's design philosophy, since creativity on the part of the player, while still a core part of the design, is a bit more pushed into the background. Otocky is a very traditional title with levels, an ending, boss battles, and skills the player can improve on, besides, music theory and creation. There are 2 creative modes which give the player more tools with which to create music in a more literal sense, but the main game needs to be beaten at least once in order to unlock them, meaning they're not really the crux of the experience. They almost feel like an afterthought if anything, but man, these 2 modes are absolutely brilliant and add so much more, giving this little disc a ton of content by 1987 standards. First off is BGM mode, essentially a free play mode where you're free to shoot the score to your heart's content. And even more ambitious, Music Maker mode, letting you play with the Famicom's sound channels to make honest-to-God songs, Mario Paint style. 1987! And being a disk system game, you can even save your creations and come back to them later. Admittedly, it's a lot less intuitive and accessible than the later games we'll be covering, since it quite literally is a music maker mode and not an interactive toy that lets you create melodies through play. But that's to be expected, seeing as how this was Iwai's first ever game, and he hadn't really expanded on his concepts yet, as we'll be seeing later. Even though these 2 modes are tucked away in the post-game, when you look at where the game industry was at the time, being so young and less receptive to non-games, it goes without saying that this was an absolute game changer for the time. Even still to this day, there's not many other musically oriented titles like Otocky with its focus on player interaction forming the soundscape. A few games have popped up over the years that tried something similar, like Rez, or any other game by Tetsuya Mizuguchi for that matter. In fact, someone on Rez's development team acknowledged that they became acquainted with the game while working on their own title, though they clarified it wasn't that much of an inspiration. So, despite being born out of a younger era of game design, Otocky still managed to innovate and create a one-of-a-kind experience for the system. Yet Iwai wasn't done yet, as he'd end up catching the attention of one of the biggest names in gaming to further expand the ideas he first touched upon with Otocky. It's both a sign of progress, and yet not much progress at all, however, when you see how Iwai's next game fared. In a true Cinderella story moment, Iwai would end up catching the attention of none other than Nintendo when a friend of his that worked within the company saw his art installation Music Insects in 1993. With Game Boy creator Gunpei Yokoi producing the project, Iwai and a small team set to work converting Music Insects to the Super Nintendo, along with 3 other creative titles packed into the cartridge that would have played along with the theme of musical creativity, and would have showcased the SNES mouse that had launched a year earlier with Mario Paint. By 1994, the game, titled Sound Fantasy, was complete, and Iwai took off to start working at art residencies again. But in his absence, a strange thing happened. Sound Fantasy was never actually released. To this day, Nintendo has never given a concrete explanation as to why this happened, but Iwai speculated in an interview with Wired that the new 3D generation of games, along with the success of Donkey Kong Country, might have given Nintendo the impression that they needed to shift focus on making their games look as sharp as possible. And this weird, child-friendly non-game that was meant to be an app for their mouse peripheral wasn't worth the effort to roll out the red carpet and give it the big box treatment. Looking at the game itself, the main attraction of Sound Fantasy is Pix Quartet, essentially a more fleshed out version of Iwai's Music Insects installation. And as far as Iwai's games go that are oriented entirely towards creativity on the part of the player, it might be his crowning achievement. At first glance, the mode appears to be a simple drawing tool, not unlike Mario Paint, but the twist comes in the form of the eponymous quartet of bugs who will walk all over your creation and chirp out a different note depending on the color of pixel they just walked over. The game previews what each color sounds like when you click on it, so you don't have to work with trial and error, which is always nice. The insects don't have to amble about aimlessly either. You can program exactly what path they'll take by using special dots which make them turn left, right, or do a complete 180. So by playing around with the different colors and selecting different bugs, you can create some real elaborate pieces, especially since you have a massive canvas to play around with, 120 by 96 to be more specific. Pix Quartet is both a surprisingly robust drawing app and an even more robust music app, all on one incredibly accessible and easy to understand screen. Kids will have a good time drawing whatever doodles come to mind, or even just randomly scribbling on the screen and seeing what sounds are produced from it. But really clever and crafty players can push both sides of the mode to its full potential, making a dedicated path for the bugs to create a layered, elaborate piece with the pixel art pushed off to the side. Four bugs might not sound like much, but it's enough for a 3-piece band with percussion, and it goes to show how much Iwai valued accessibility in his games. Even back in the day, before modern, more elaborate programs like FL Studio and Ableton existed, if you wanted to make actual, honest-to-God music, you would just buy an actual music-making program. And the number of instruments you can swap between each bug really gives you an amazing amount of possibilities to run wild with your creativity. For kids growing up in the early 90s, Mario Paint was a landmark piece of software that opened the door for animation, music, art, all topped off with a warm, friendly, and inviting presentation. Sound Fantasy might be a bit more avant-garde with its art style, but it gives such insane potential for creativity with this hybrid mode, something completely unlike any other paint or music program to this day. It really is nothing short of incredible, and really just makes it sting all the more when you remember how Nintendo unceremoniously pulled the rug right out from under its feet, denying a generation of kids the opportunity to try it. The other 2 games packed into the cartridge are far less elaborate, but are fun distractions from what can be considered the main mode. Beat Hopper is kind of similar to Otocky in terms of its design philosophy, in that it's a really simple arcade-type game that allows the player to freestyle some pretty basic beats. If I had to nitpick, I kinda wish the camera was pulled back a bit and the mouse moved the bug alone rather than the entire background, as it can be kinda disorienting, though it does give a bit of a challenge. The final mode, Starfly, is kind of like an interactive music box where you place your notes, represented by stars, all over the screen, and watch a melody play out, with higher stars playing higher pitched notes and vice versa. And again, has quite a ceiling for potential melodies while still remaining accessible and engaging to younger players. Though I have to reiterate, it's not nearly as in-depth as Pix Quartet. Now you might be wondering how I'm showing crisp footage of Sound Fantasy on screen if it missed its '94 release date. Well, much like a certain other unreleased SNES title, a build of the game was leaked online in 2015. Though much like Star Fox 2, this is a pretty early prototype that doesn't quite fully show what the finished product would have been. Aside from going by a different working title, Sound Factory, this earlier version lacks some of the quality of life polish that would have been seen in the final game, such as the tiles in Beat Hopper being a little less clear about how many more times you could jump on them.
And sometimes bug escapes. You can use the tweezers.
But the real omission that's yet to be unearthed still to this day is an entire mode. Ice Sweeper would have been the fourth game on the card, and much like Otocky before it, it takes a rather simple, time-tested arcade game, in this case brick-breaking games like Arkanoid, and puts an improvised melodic flourish to it where the ball, the paddle, and the blocks all let out a chime with each bounce and impact. It really makes you wonder if Nintendo could finally release Star Fox 2 after so many years of being non-canon and locked away in their vault. Why can't they do the same for the final build of Sound Fantasy? The tech itself might be limited, but the design of these 4 games, Pix Quartet especially, still shines almost 30 years later, and it'd really be great to see this lost bit of history finally done justice. Fortunately, the story doesn't quite have as bleak an ending as it might seem. Nintendo would make it up to Iwai in the end, more on that later, and the defining mode of Sound Fantasy didn't end up being trapped as vaporware as you might think. With history repeating itself, Iwai once again put his Music Insects installation on display in a local Japanese art museum, and a visiting development team took notice. Though instead of a native Japanese developer, it was instead American developer and publisher Maxis visiting from abroad. They tracked down Iwai and, like Nintendo before them, asked if they could take his art installation concept and put it into video game form. This wasn't the first time Maxis had done something like this, as they had worked with another Japanese developer, Yut Saito, in bringing his excellent PC title The Tower to Western markets, bringing it under the umbrella of their Sim series in the process. Iwai said yes and worked closely with Maxis to finally bring Music Insects to the gaming medium, and this time it finally came out in 1996 under the title of SimTunes. While there might be a lot less quantity to SimTunes, having only the Pix Quartet mode, it absolutely makes up for it with quality, polishing its singular mode to be even better than its SNES iteration, making it more accessible for the newcomers and the young players it was marketed towards, while raising the ceiling of potential for those already musically oriented and wanting to create even more elaborate pieces than previously. To start with, the measly 16 insects you could select in Sound Fantasy has been bumped up to a whopping 48, with everything from percussion, vocal samples, and miscellaneous sound effects. The canvas is also much bigger, giving the little critters far more room to move around and interact with the sound cues while still having plenty of room to draw. And then there's all the nice little additions to help kids get the hang of it easier, most notably a ton of additional sample SimTunes to set an example or even edit. There's also stamps, a really in-depth tutorial, and flavor text attached to each bug to tell you what they do and what other bugs they're best paired with. There's just so much here to help kids dive in and just have fun without even needing to understand how it's supposed to work. Again, like Sound Fantasy, it can just be used as a simple paint tool to see what sounds come out of your scribbles. But the cherry on top of it all, a feature that was begging to be implemented, is the ability to share your creations with other people, even if they don't own SimTunes themselves personally. Had Sound Fantasy come out, it would have been a few years premature to the release of Nintendo's online Satellaview system, meaning your creations couldn't easily be shared like the RPG Maker, for example, which came later. SimTunes, however, lets you share your masterpieces right out of the box, and it's such a fine addition to one of Iwai's games, driving the whole creativity angle right home out of the park. SimTunes might not have the same player base as the mini-games of Will Wright, especially nowadays given its age, but you better believe there's still a dedicated few that have made some incredible stuff using the elaborate pieces provided, showing just what this software is capable of. While I do have a soft spot for Sound Fantasy due to its side modes and utilization of the SNES sound chip, it's hard to deny that SimTunes really is the better game. They took the best mode with the most potential from the original title and polished it to an absolute sheen, making one of the best games in Maxis' entire Sim catalog, and bringing a real tragedy of an unreleased title to retail shelves at last. There is a downside, however, because of course there is, poor UI, and that's how SimTunes has yet to see any re-release to this day, possibly because the rights for the game are caught up between Maxis and Iwai himself. Whether it's Nintendo or EA, someone really needs to bring Music Insects back to modern platforms. The success of creativity-driven games, especially those marketed towards a younger demographic, is proof that Music Insects could thrive in today's gaming landscape. Despite the unfortunate circumstances surrounding Sound Fantasy, Nintendo would ultimately make it up to Iwai with our final game from 2006, Electroplankton. And they really rolled out the red carpet for this game. There was a massive exhibit promoting not just the game, but Iwai and his body of work in general. They even brought a display showing the box, manual, and history of Sound Fantasy. Even if you missed all this hype Nintendo was drumming up, the very cover of Electroplankton's case proudly states, created by Toshio Iwai. According to Satoru Iwata, this is literally because Iwai made the entire game himself, a statement that I'm a little skeptical of its veracity. But it's open to interpretation, and it's possible the devs at Indie Zero polished up and finished what he did indeed make himself. Either way, this was before auteur game developers were really much of a thing, so Nintendo doing so much to promote Iwai and his work was really a nice gesture, and almost made up for how they kind of fucked him over back in the 90s by killing off Sound Fantasy before its time. And it is fitting that Nintendo themselves would publish the title because it really does feel like a spiritual successor to Sound Fantasy. Being a bunch of small music creation tools, many of which were also based on Iwai's interactive installations. I'll say up front that none of them match the brilliance and depth of Pix Quartet, but there's a really solid amount of variety and selection here. Not to mention nicely taking advantage of the DS's features like the touchscreen of course, but also the often neglected microphone. If there's one advantage Electroplankton has over Sound Fantasy, it's the presentation, creating a hypnotic sense of atmosphere. Sound Fantasy had a dreamlike ambience of its own as well, but the relaxing bubbling sounds in the main menu, and the luminescent plankton shining in front of dark, murky waters. This is a game that demands to be played in the dark, and with some headphones to appreciate the sound design at work. In fact, the Japanese release of Electroplankton came bundled with a pair of earbuds to ensure that the player would get the optimal experience. With 12 plankton altogether, and none of them particularly deep, I won't be going over all of them, but there are quite a few fun and engaging titles here, with some of my favorites being Tracy, Luminaria, and Sun Animalcule. Only one of them has a win condition this time around. Hanenbo, which would later become known as the worst goddamn Smash Bros. Stage in existence, challenges you to turn all the leaves red by mastering the mechanics of launching the plankton at the right angle, eventually getting a flower to bloom if you do it right. Some of the modes are unfortunately slight duds, particularly Vol Voice, which is just a bunch of voice filters meant to show off the DS's mic. And some of them, while enjoyable, don't feel particularly deep enough to make really rich compositions. But the highlights of this title are easily worth it, and even the shallower modes among them are enjoyable enough to play around with for a bit. And above all else, they stay true to Iwai's vision of being easy to jump into, not even requiring any sort of manual or external instructions to immediately understand. Again, much like the installations that Iwai made in the past. And believe me, while it has even less of a following than SimTunes, people have made some pretty elaborate pieces with what's been given to them. The strength of the creation tools here, however, really just serves to compound Electroplankton's biggest issue, and the one thing critics really raked the game over the coals for back in the day. Your inability to save your creations. You don't even need to turn the game off. The moment you back out of a specific mode, the tune you made just vanishes into thin air. Not only is this a serious downgrade coming off of SimTunes, but it also takes a lot of fine fiddly work in order to get your creation sounding just right. Out of all Iwai's games, Electroplankton definitely sticks the hardest to the toy mindset and really isn't trying to be any sort of elaborate music making program the way SimTunes was. And that mentality is the reason why a save feature wasn't included. In an interview with Cubed 3, Iwai explained that he didn't want the software to become a tool with menus, windows, and files the player would have to name. Quite a 180 from Otocky's Music Maker mode, which as I mentioned before had saving and was quite literally a tool with no gamification to the creation process. But Iwai also explained that saving would have been difficult and rather stressful for the player since some of the plankton would have had to save voice clips from the mic, and rather than making a game where you can only sometimes save or wait an eternity to save, he decided to just forego the feature altogether. While it might still be a letdown, it's an admirable commitment to his vision that he saw through to the very end, even if he knew there would be some blowback. On a more positive note, Electroplankton has a genius new addition, an advantage it holds over all of Iwai's other titles: Audience Mode. The game quite literally plays itself in real time, putting on a performance for you to just sit back and enjoy without requiring any input on the part of the player. The game even encourages the player to hook the DS up to a stereo system and listen to it as though it were an album, as the plankton automatically shift from one to another like a track list. Aside from just being enjoyable to sit back and listen to these John Cage-esque ambient orchestral sounds, it also allows the player to watch for themselves and pick up on how to get the most out of the plankton. You might hear a little scale or rhythm you want to incorporate into your own performances, but it can also give the player a better idea of how to play certain modes, since they make more sense when you see them in motion. You can sort of look at audience mode as a successor to the sample or example presets in SimTunes, but far more inventive and engaging, even for those that have already learned the ropes of Electroplankton. Overall, for Iwai's last game to date, it's a strong note to go out on and was a bold, different kind of title from the DS's early years before the system really took off. However, timing wasn't the only thing that kept Electroplankton an obscure title. Being Toshio Iwai, his games had to release with some sort of hitch, and despite Nintendo eagerly promoting and publishing the title, they kept it a tragically limited release in North America. Perhaps not confident that something so avant-garde would sell, even for the more casual install base of the DS. As a result, Electroplankton was limited to online orders and the then new Nintendo World Store in New York's Rockefeller Plaza. Other retailers could pick up the game if they wish. For example, up here in Canada, the title was available at EB Games, but many chose not to jump on it for the same reason as Nintendo. The only reason, if any, that Electroplankton is still present in the modern player's consciousness would be that aforementioned Smash stage. Luckily, 3 years later, Electroplankton would be more widely available when Nintendo broke up its various modes and released them individually on the DSiWare store for $2 a pop. Since there's 10 modes, that effectively makes it a $20 package altogether, already a bargain compared to what Electroplankton was going for on the aftermarket at the time. While it was a smart idea and something on the DSiWare store, an uncommon occurrence I know, it's still worth tracking down the proper retail release if you can, since having to back out to the DSi or 3DS menus every time you want to switch modes is kinda cumbersome.
で、正直言うとですね、僕もいろんなさっき見せたこういうOtockyだとか、未発売のサウンドファンタジーとかですね、それから任天堂 DS 用のエレクトロプランクトン、そしてテノリオンって、作ってはきましたが、これもう全部全て製造中止になってるんですよね。でなおかつ僕が作っている時にもしかしたらこれで世の中が変わるかもしれないと思ったような、そういう何ていうんですかね、ある種のヒットというか、そういうことにはなかなか至らず、当然評価はされたし、一部の人にはすごく熱狂的に受け入れられたっていうことはあるんですけども、ただそれよりもはるかにですね、この100階建てというの家っていう絵本はもう本当にすごく子どもたちに支持されて今も売れ続けていると。だからそれに関して僕はどう自分のことをね、どう考えたらいいんだろうっていうのは今でも思いますよね。
Giving credit where credit is due, it really was nice to see Nintendo finally give Iwai the credit and shelf space he deserved, and you could tell from all the promotional write-ups they did for him that they had high respect for its work, and it's not hard to see why. Everyone wants there to be more varied experiences out there in gaming, and while for many that means more of an emphasis on narrative or theming, Iwai's games do neither of these things but are still beautiful, fine-tuned experiences that stick with you and have the potential to bring out one's creative side. From a kid's perspective, yes, but really from any age. I would say it's a shame that Iwai never made another game, but luckily the art media world isn't missing him altogether. Aside from still cranking out wonderful installation pieces, Iwai has dabbled in performance art with Ryuichi Sakamoto, another recent subject on this channel, children's television, children's books, and even made an outright toy of his own with Yamaha, the Tonori On, stating he wanted to have more control over the product than if he were making software for someone else's hardware. It also got a very limited port on the Bandai WonderSwan. Iwai has proven himself to be a musical, technological renaissance man, and of course being a freak about video games, I'm most fascinated by the brilliant design of his titles. He still has plenty more to give to the art and technology scene, and we're all the better for it.
I am a king.